I'm going to start today's lesson by going over the map. The map that you see in front of you right now has the cities filled in. If you need to pause the video and fill those in real quick, feel free to do that. Notice that on the map, the different seas are filled in also: Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Caspian, and the Red Sea. Please don't forget, as you complete your map, to follow directions, to go ahead and color in the different bodies of water. The reason that I ask you to do that is so that you'll know where the bodies of water are. Often students who aren't familiar with other parts of the world outside the United States aren't sure whether an area is land or whether it's water, and so by going ahead and coloring that in, that is cementing in your brain the areas of water versus the areas of land. Now we're going to go ahead and just review the Sumerian pantheon. We went over this in class last week. Remember that the Sumerians had 7 major gods that they called the Anuna, and then they had a lot of other minor gods that they called the Igigi gods. On the first day of class, when we talked about the creation of the world, we mentioned that the Igigi gods were the ones who had to do all the work before man was created. Remember that An or Anu was the god of heaven. Ninhursag, whose title meant Lady of the Foothills, was the mother goddess, and she assisted in the creation of man. Enki or Ea was the lord of the earth. He was the god of wisdom and also of fresh water. Enlil was the lord of the wind, the god of the air. Inanna, also known as Ishtar, was the queen of heaven, and she was the goddess of love and of war. Utu or Shamash was the god of the sun and of justice. And Nana, meaning the illuminator, was the god of the moon, and recall that he had different names based on the different phases of the moon. We're going to go ahead and finish up filling in that worksheet by going over the Babylonian gods. So if you haven't already gotten that worksheet out, go ahead and pause this video and go and get it. The first Babylonian god that I want to mention to you is Marduk. He was the god of magic. Here's a drawing of a statue of the god Marduk with his dragon that was found on a Babylonian cylinder seal. You read about cylinder seals this past week. Remember that cylinder seals were engraved into stone, and when they rolled the cylinder seal over wet clay, it would leave behind a picture. Now, even though these were a form of artwork, they weren't meant to solely be artwork. Each important person would have their own cylinder seal, and when they wanted to sign their signature, they would just roll it over the wet clay, and that would be their unique signature. It's similar to how European kings and even Asiatic kings for many years used a signet ring to seal into wax or whatever they were using to seal into. And Chinese artists today still use a seal that has been carved into stone to sign their work. Jeremiah chapter 50 records a prophecy of Jeremiah predicting the downfall of Babylon, in which Marduk will be filled with terror. And it says, "Announce and proclaim among the nations, lift up a banner and proclaim it. Keep nothing back, but say, Babylon will be captured, Bel will be put to shame, Marduk filled with terror. Her images will be put to shame, and her idols filled with terror." The god Marduk actually killed another one of the gods, a goddess named Tiamat. She was the goddess of salt water, chaos, and she was considered to be the mother of the first gods. Bel, whose name meant Lord, was the god of sages, and sages is just a fancy word for wise men, people who had knowledge and studied things. Apsu was the ruler of the gods, and he was the god of fresh water. Apsu is depicted with water coming out of his shoulders. Remember, the Tiamat was the goddess of salt waters. She was the female principle, and she represented chaos. Apsu was the god of fresh waters. He was the male principle, and he was the god of order. But there's one more god that was a god of water, and if you recall, that was the god Ea or Enki. He was the god of the earth, but also he was the god of fresh waters, and he also is depicted with water coming out of his shoulders. At one point, Ea decides that he wants to overthrow the rule of Apsu. And so he tricks Apsu into falling asleep, he kills him, and then to add insult to injury, he uses Apsu's body to build an underground palace for himself. The ancient people believed that there was water underneath the earth. That is something that the Bible also talks about. We'll go over the Assyrian god. Now, keep in mind that the Babylonians worshipped all the gods of the Sumerians, and then they added more gods to that. In fact, the god Ea, after he overthrows Apsu, becomes the father of Marduk. The Assyrians worshipped all the gods of the Sumerians, all the gods of the Babylonians, and then they added their own special god to that, what we call pantheon, or family of false, of course, gods and goddesses. And their main god was Ansur, or Assur. A city was named after Assur, and that's where we get the name Assyrian from. An meant heaven, Shar, or Sur, meant whole or entire, and so they believed that Anshur, or Assur, was the god of all of heaven. For the Assyrians, he became the chief god. I'd like to talk a little bit about these statues. This is where we left off last week. Mesopotamian religious beliefs weren't based on feelings or on faith. Instead, they were based on the belief in the power of ritual, and it was the temples that provided a location for these rituals. Worshippers in Mesopotamia respected and they feared the gods, but they rarely felt a sense of love or support for them. There was a hierarchy where the gods were at the top of that hierarchy and humans were at the bottom, and so humans were required to submit to the gods. There were two ways that the Sumerians believed that they could appease the gods. One of those ways was through prayer. Archaeologists and historians have discovered several surviving prayers that were written by the early Sumerians, and these prayers usually focus on preventing punishment from the gods and even asking for protection from them, usually protection from evil. One prayer that actually survives reads, "Gods who judge cases for the land, the ordainers of destiny, the ones who drop design, the apportioner of lots for heaven and earth, in your power in decreeing of destinies, the destiny of life is yours to ordain. Let me escape evil." So, one thing that I want you to notice about this particular prayer is that it has a long list of all the God's most wonderful attributes, and then there's a very short, very brief request at the end. And when historians read through the surviving prayers from Sumeria, that is a pattern that they see over and over again. The prayers have a long, drawn-out praise for the gods or God, and then at the end they just have a very short, very brief, "This is what I want from you. This is what I want from you." The surviving prayers also request for protection from harm. For example, a prayer to the messenger of the gods, Nuski, to prevent a nightmare from coming true, illustrates the importance of dreams, which were thought to foretell the future. And that prayer reads, "This dream, which was brought to me in the evening, midnight, and morning, which you understand, but I do not, it is evil. May the evil not overtake me." And so in these prayers, they find a lot of concern about evil coming and humans not being able to prevent the evil, and so they're asking the gods to prevent that evil for them. In addition to prayer, the other way to please the gods was to give them gifts. And archaeologists have found hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of what they call these votive figures. And that is the picture that you see right in front of you. Just examples of these votive figures. These little statues were not idols. They didn't worship these statues. Instead, they were made as depictions of themselves, carved into stone, carved into usually gypsum. And then they would bring these little votive figures to the temple, and the priests would set these little votive figures in front of the idol of the god or the goddess. Because there were so many of these votive figures produced, they have survived. Also being made of stone, they were very durable. These votive figures depict men wearing fleecy, shaggy skirts from the waist down to the feet. Some of them have beards. Some of them are clean shaven. Some of them are even bald. They have many different hairstyles. The female figures wear the same kind of shaggy material as the men's skirts, but these dresses are pinned at one shoulder with a sleeve falling over one of their arms and the other shoulder bare. The women also have a wide variety of hairstyles. Some of them have it piled up on their head in buns. Sometimes it's worn over their shoulders, and anything in between. Sometimes the figures are shown standing, and other times they're shown sitting. But always, 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 they have extra large eyes, as if they're pleading their innocence and pleading their need to the God that they're standing before. And they always have their hands clasped in prayer. Again, archaeologists imagine that the statues were lined up in rows and rows and rows, with hundreds of different statues of all different sizes, reminding the god that the individual depicted in the little votive figure had brought them gifts. Another thing that we didn't have the time to delve into more thoroughly last time we met was cuneiform. We did discuss that one of the 5 characteristics of a civilization was a written language, and you read briefly this past week about hieroglyphics and cuneiform. Right now we're going to talk about tokens. Tokens were small geometric clay objects, cylinders, cones, spheres, that have been found all over Mesopotamia. The earliest tokens were single shapes that stood for basic agricultural commodities such as grain and sheep. As far as archaeologists can tell, a specific shape of a token always represents a specific quantity of a particular item. For example, the cone stood for a small measure of grain, and the sphere represented a large measure of grain. The oval stood for a jar of oil. 2 jars of oil would be represented by 2 ovals, 3 jars by 3 ovals, and so on. And these tokens presented a symbol of the things being counted, but also a system of great specificity and precision. In other words, each one stood for an exact thing and even an exact amount of that thing. As cities began to develop and a more complex economy came along with it, the tokens also became more complex. They start to have complicated designs on them and even holes. Now, as far as archaeologists can tell, the Sumerians would make a holding container, a ball, out of clay. And so, for example, if someone in a city wanted his servant to take so many measures of oil to someone in another city, they wanted to be paid for that, they would put the correct number of tokens into this container made of clay. It would be sealed off. It was usually in the shape of a smear or a ball, and inside of it would be these tokens. And so when the servant would arrive, the man who wanted to buy the oil from the other man would break open that little clay envelope, and he would be able to count the amount that the person who's trying to sell the oil said he sent, and then they could count the amount that actually arrived and see that this was an honest deal and he hasn't been cheated. At some point, someone decided that it would be easier to carry a drawing of what the tokens represented rather than the tokens themselves. And so this was the beginning of Sumerian writing. Not necessarily the beginning of Chinese writing, not necessarily the beginning of Egyptian writing or Greek writing or any of the other civilizations that developed writing. But as far as archaeologists can tell, that is how it began with the Sumerians. The writing system changed a lot through the years. The original direction of writing was top to bottom, just like the Chinese. For reasons that archaeologists aren't sure of, it changed from left to right. This affected the placement of the signs. They had to be rotated about 90 degrees counterclockwise. And you can see in the sample there, just following the foot. The foot is up and down, and then when it changed the orientation of the writing, the foot looks like it's reclining. Another change involved the style of the signs. The original signs were made up of lines and curves, but the strokes started to evolve into the classical wedge-shaped. And eventually, scribes used a stylus that was a wedge, and so there was no way for them to make lines or curves anymore. All they could make was these wedge-shaped characters that we call cuneiform. I think it's interesting on the diagram here, just the evolution of some of the words. For example, the water. Water starts out with wavy lines, and then as it becomes more stylized, it's very, very static. There's no movement to the water anymore. This is just a sample of what cuneiform looked like when it was actually being used. Before we move on to this week's work, I'd also like to go a little bit further into the standard of Ur. Remember that it was found in a tomb next to someone who was dressed in army regalia, and so early archaeologists thought that it was probably a war banner, and so they called it the standard. Another name for a war banner is a standard that you would bring into battle with you, so they called it the standard of Ur. Remember that it has a war side, which is depicted here, and also a peace side. Here we see a wagon that is being drawn by 4 donkeys. And I suspect the reason why they said donkeys is because the evidence probably shows that the Sumerians didn't actually have horses. They had no access to actual horses. What they had access to during this time period in this part of the world was donkeys. And notice you can count 1, 2, 3, 4 tails, which shows you that it is 1, 2, 3, 4 donkeys there. Here we have men in the army who have their capes over them, and they are each carrying a spear. The interesting thing is that this must have been their army uniform at the time. They're all dressed the same. And so this is very much evidence of a advanced society, because it has a government, because only a government can afford to dress all of their soldiers in a uniform. That's something actually that the American government at the beginning of the Revolution could not afford to do. Here we have a figure that's larger than the other figures, and so we assume that this is their ruler, their king. Anytime in ancient portraiture, whether it is in Egypt or Sumeria in this case, important figures are shown to be important by making them much larger than the rest of the figures in the artwork. Here we have a prisoner of war who's getting ready to have his head chopped off. And here we have prisoners of war who are being humiliated by being forced to be paraded around with no clothes on. This isn't the only place that we have humiliated prisoners of war. And here we see enemies being trampled by the horses and the wagons. Now on the peace side of the standard of Ur, we have the larger figure once again, and that is probably the king again, maybe celebrating his victory in battle, or just the leader of the banquet, the one holding the banquet. Here we have what we assume is a musician holding a musical instrument. And here we have guests at the banquet sitting in chairs and holding cups with their drink inside of it. Here we have someone carrying things on their back. And here we have some donkeys, and I can count the tails, and I see 1, 2, 3, probably 3 tails there. Here we have a man herding a goat. Notice the goat has horns on it. And here we have a man carrying fish. One of the exciting things about finding the standard of Ur is that it helped archaeologists and historians understand better the uses of some of the things that they were digging up. For example, this artifact right here. When it was found, archaeologists had no idea what it was used for. They could make a lot of observations. It was made out of 2 different kinds of metal, and on the top there appears to be the figure of a donkey. But what was it actually used for? They had a difficult time inferring what it was used for. The standard of Ur helped them with that task. You'll notice in this picture that an object similar to the one pictured on the left is on the back of the horse. And so what archaeologists inferred was that artifacts such as this were used as part of the wagon mechanism, probably to help keep the reins up off the back of the donkeys and make them more maneuverable and more comfortable. This artifact stumped archaeologists when they found it. Now, right now, it's been restrung and it looks very much like a musical instrument. But when they first found it, there were no strings attached to it. And so archaeologists could make observations. It's made out of wood. It's inlaid with precious jewels. It has the face of a bull at the front of it, but they had no idea what this was used for. When they discovered the standard of Ur, they saw a man holding something almost identical to it, and they could tell that it was strung, and so they inferred that this was a musical instrument. And so it's portrayed in a museum today with strings so that people can tell that it's meant to be a musical instrument, perhaps an early form of a lyre. And here's another picture of a votive figure. We can tell that it's a person. We can make that observation. But the pictures depicted on the standard of Ur help give it a little more context. We can see that in both artifacts that there's a shaggy skirt being worn by the individual. This past week you also read briefly about Sargon of Akkad. He has a very interesting story. I hope you enjoyed reading it. One of the reasons that I find it so interesting is because it is actually similar to the story of Moses, where he was set into a reed basket that was painted with pitch so that it wouldn't sink, and he was just set adrift. In this case, instead of being set adrift on the Nile, he was set adrift on either the Tigris or the Euphrates. To be honest with you, I can't remember right this moment which one it was. And so he is raised by a gardener. He ends up becoming the cupbearer to the king of Kish, which is a very trusted position. And eventually the king of Kish realizes that he has put his trust in the wrong man, because Sargon rebels and takes over the kingdom of Kish. And from there, he takes over most of Mesopotamia. You read that in the year 2240 BC, he unified northern Mesopotamia with the kingdoms in southern Mesopotamia and had a very large area that he ruled. And for this reason, historians consider this to be the first empire. Unfortunately, as time went by, later kings weren't able to maintain that sized empire, and so the kingdom of Sumeria shrank, and shrank some more with the Amorite invasions. It wouldn't be until the rule of Hammurabi of Babylon that the area once ruled by Sargon of Akkad would be under Mesopotamian rule again. Hammurabi is the one who had the famous Code of Hammurabi. He had the list of laws that he expected his citizens to obey, and so that is very historically significant. Right now I'd like to turn our attention to this week's homework, and we're going to start by discussing briefly Mesopotamian pottery. In your homework assignment this week, you do have a handout entitled Mesopotamian Pottery, and we're going to talk a little bit about that right now, because pottery fragments are common artifacts that are found by archaeologists. There's a large quantity of pieces of pottery at any given archaeological site because pottery is very durable. It can last for thousands of years, whether it's been buried in the ground or lying on the surface. And so for today's archaeologists, pottery holds clues to past life. Archaeologists and other historians have learned through their research that pottery styles are distinctive to particular groups of people, and the styles change over time. This knowledge, which is refined as more research is done, helps archaeologists determine how old a site is. When they find a piece of pottery, they can compare it to other pieces of pottery they've found, and they find that because pottery styles change over time, they can determine about when it was made and what kind of people were living in the area at the time. Halaf pottery is some of the oldest pottery that they have found. When they tried to date this pottery, they found that it was about 8,000 years old. It was created around 6,000 BC. And I discussed this a little bit on the first day of class, how the beautiful, beautiful Halaf pottery almost mystified archaeologists when they first found it because it was so technologically advanced and so beautiful. Halaf pottery was handmade, and the reason it's called Halaf is because it was first found in the city of Tel Halaf. It's characterized by distinctive pink clay, and it is normally painted with geometric designs or animals using one or two colors. Ubiad pottery isn't quite as delicate as the Halaf pottery, and it's also not quite as old. They estimate that it was created between 5,000 and 4,000 BC. They can tell that Ubiad pottery wasn't handmade. Instead, it was made on a very slow potter's wheel called by archaeologists a turnet. And it was first found near the city of Tel al-Ubiad. It's characterized by geometric designs and concentric circles that they think probably were painted while the pots were still on the wheel. It's also very beautiful. Next we come to Uruk pottery, and you can see that the artistic design is starting to go down. We discussed that on the first day of class. Uruk pottery is not nearly as beautiful or as delicate as either the Ubiad or the Halaf pottery. They estimate that it was made between 4,000 and 3,000 BC. Uruk pottery was also made on a potter's wheel or in a mold, and it was first found near the city of Uruk. It's characterized by either red or gray clay, and there isn't really any decoration on it. It was made quick, it was made to be disposable, and in my opinion, it was made ugly. The Jemdet Nasir pottery was probably made between 3,500 and 3,000 BC. It also was made on a potter's wheel, and it was first found in the city of Jemdet Nasir, and I may be pronouncing that wrong. Please forgive me. It's characterized by being large and thick and being decorated with geometrical and natural designs in black or red paint. We have a couple of vocabulary words this week that I'm going to go ahead and give you the definition of. The first is parallelism. In literature, parallelism occurs when phrases in a sentence or in a poem have similar or even the same grammatical structure. The other vocabulary word is repetition. And repetition is a literary device that involves intentionally using the same word or the same phrases for an effect, at least 2 times and often more than 2 times. This is very common in Sumerian poetry. Actually, both parallelism and repetition are very common in Sumerian poetry. And so to give you an example of that, we're going to analyze part of the poem of Ishtar and Damuzid. Ishtar, if you recall, has the alternate name of Inanna, and Damuzid has the alternate name of Tammuz. Different societies gave them different names, but the same story occurs over and over again. I'm going to briefly summarize the story for you, and then we are going to get out the literature assignment entitled Inanna's descent, and we're going to analyze that together. So the first thing I'd like to tell you is that there are many different versions of this story. You'll probably find online a version that says that Inanna decided to go down into the underworld to save Tammuz or Dumuzi, that he died and she decides to go down into the underworld to save him. More recent archaeological work has discovered better and more complete versions of the story, and so we now realize that Inanna or Ishtar wasn't going down into the underworld to save Dumuzi or Tammuz, that instead she's the one who chooses to send him there. The story of Inanna descending into the underworld has a little bit of background to it. Those of you who have already read the Epic of Gilgamesh know that Gilgamesh was the king of the city of Uruk. His best friend, Enkidu, and he decide to go on an adventure, and they end up killing the guardian of the sacred forests, and the gods are angry with them for doing that. However, Inanna or Ishtar is very impressed with Gilgamesh, and she appears to him and to Enkidu, and she tries to get Gilgamesh to accept a marriage proposal for her. The text of the Epic of Gilgamesh explains that Gilgamesh was very familiar with Ishtar's reputation for being very loving for a season, but once she tires of the object of her affection being very hateful and destructive to them. And so he turns down her proposal of marriage, which infuriates Ishtar. Ishtar goes to Anu, who is the king of the gods, at least at this point in Mesopotamian history, and she begs Anu to send the Bull of Heaven to punish King Gilgamesh. The Bull of Heaven is sent to Gilgamesh's city, the city of Uruk, and begins to kill the people there until Gilgamesh and Enkidu are able to stop the destruction and kill the Bull of Heaven. This infuriates Ishtar even more, and she leaves. So that's the background of the story of Inanna or Ishtar going into the underworld. Now, to continue the story, what readers of the Epic of Gilgamesh don't know is that the Bull of Heaven has a name. It is Gugalana, and the Bull of Heaven is actually the husband of Ishtar or Inanna's sister, Ereshkigal. So, in Ishtar's passion and anger to punish King Gilgamesh, instead she ends up killing her brother-in-law. Unwisely, Ishtar decides that she is going to go to the funeral of her brother-in-law. And not without reason, Ereshkigal is angry with her. And so, as she comes to the first gate leading to the underworld, the keeper of the gate sends word to Ereshkigal, Queen of the Dead, that her sister wants to attend the wedding. She wants to descend into the underworld. And so Ereshkigal gives instructions to each of the keepers of the 7 gates that lead to the underworld to demand tribute from Ishtar or Inanna as she descends. Now, she is dressed in a lovely robe. She has earrings on, she has beads on, she has rings on, and she has a crown, but she hasn't brought anything else with her because she wasn't expecting, in going to visit her sister, to have to give a tribute at each of the 7 gates. And so, very famously, the poem begins this way. From the great above, she opened her ear to the great below. From the great above, the goddess opened her ear to the great below. From the great above, Inanna opened her ear to the great below. Ishtar begins this journey, and she's just worried enough about going to the funeral of the Bull of Heaven, her brother-in-law, Gugalana, that she instructs her faithful servant and advisor, a woman named Ninshuber, that if she doesn't come back after several days, to seek help from Enki to get her back out of the underworld. So she comes to the first gate, and the gatekeeper asks her who she is, and she answers, I am Inanna, Queen of Heaven. Because my older sister, Ereshkigal, her husband, Gugalana, the Bull of Heaven, has died, I've come to witness the funeral rites. In one version of the story, when she's asked to give the tribute, she slaps her thigh and bites her lip. But she doesn't say anything. She just goes ahead and gives the tribute. And at the first gate, she takes off her royal crown. But she does ask, as politely as she's able to, why she's required to give a tribute in order to go visit her sister. And she's told to be quiet because the ways of the underworld are perfect and they are not to be questioned. So she comes to the second gate and she has to give another tribute and goes to the third and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth gate, and she keeps having to take off her beautiful jewelry and hand it over as a tribute. And she gets to the seventh gate and she has no jewelry left. And the only thing she has left is her royal gown, and they insist that she take off that. So she comes before her sister, Ereshkigal, embarrassed and humbled. And when she gets there, instead of finding a sister who is happy to see her, she finds a sister who's still angry with her for the death of her husband, who she blames on Inanna. Ereshkigal calls the judges of the underworld, and they surround her and they pass judgment against her. So instead of going to Gugalana's funeral, she ends up going to her own funeral. She's told that she's not allowed to leave the underworld, that she has to stay there. And in fact, they strike her and she dies, and she is turned into a corpse and she's hung on a hook on the wall. After 3 days, Ninshurbar realizes that Inanna's not coming back. She follows her commands and she goes to Enki for help. And Enki sends along what are called Gala. They are the Mesopotamian version of demons. So 2 demons travel with Ninshurbar to the underworld. The Gala have been instructed by Enki to attach themselves like flies to Ereshkigal and make her uncomfortable. And so that is exactly what they do as she's talking to Ninshurbar and telling Ninshurbar that she can't take Inanna back with her, that she's already been judged and has to stay in the underworld. They buzz around her like flies and annoy her, and she becomes very distressed. And in a moment of weakness, or maybe in a moment of deception, the Gala sympathize with her, and she's so taken aback and happy that someone is sympathizing with her in her distress that Ereshkigal tells them that they can have a prize, that they can have a gift from her. And so they tell her that they choose the piece of meat that is hanging on the wall by the hook, and of course that is the body of Inanna. Now, unbeknownst to Ereshkigal, Enki has given the Gala the food and water of life to revive her, and she comes back from the dead. At this point, Ereshkigal feels like some of her anger has abated, and so she agrees to let Inanna leave the underworld if and only if she can find somebody else to take her place. Now, Inanna has a reputation for not being a very nice goddess, and so I suspect that Ereshkigal had in the back of her mind that there was no way that she was going to get anybody to agree to switch places with her. Nevertheless, Ereshkigal sends Inanna back out of the underworld along with the Gala, and the Gala are supposed to bring back the substitute. So at first she thinks that she'll send Ninshurbar back to take her place, but Ninshurbar has been such a faithful friend to her that she decides, no, that would be wrong to send her back after she's rescued me. When she returns to her palace, she sees her 2 sons, Shara and Lulal, and at first she thinks, I can send one of the boys back in my place, but then her motherly heart decides no, that would be wrong. Also, Shara and Lulal are dressed in sackcloth and in ashes, and they've been mourning their mother, and her heart turns toward them, and she decides, no, I won't send them back in my place. The next person she sees is her maidservant, Kara, and she considers sending Kara back in her place, but like her sons, Kara has dressed herself in sackcloth and has put ashes on her head, and she's been mourning the loss of Inanna. And so her heart is turned again, and she decides, no, I can't send Kara back in my place either. Inanna eventually goes to her throne room, and there she finds her husband, Dumuzi, dressed in all of his royal robes, sitting on her throne. It's her throne, not his throne. And she decides, that's who I'm going to send back in my place. And so she unleashes the Gala on him, and they take him to the underworld. Now, Dumuzi's sister, Geshtinana, is so upset that her brother has been taken to the underworld that she volunteers to go to the underworld in his place. And they broker an arrangement where for 6 months, Dumuzi or Tammuz will stay in the underworld, and the other 6 months, his sister Geshtinana will stay in the underworld. Now, for 40 days before Demuzid or Tammuz is supposed to come back from the underworld, worshippers of Inanna would spend the time in mourning and in fasting and in praying and in crying and hoping that he would come back. That's actually something that the Israelites began to do, and one of the prophets reprimanded the women of Israel for mourning over Tammuz. He said they shouldn't be doing that. They shouldn't be worshiping Ishtar and keeping the 40-day vigil for him to come back. When he comes back, we have the first day of spring, we have a celebration, and that celebration is called Easter. And so, unfortunately, our resurrection day has somehow become associated with that same holiday, probably because they both happen in the spring, and they both involve resurrections. The assignment that you have is to look for examples of parallelism and repetition in the short excerpt that I've given you of Inanna's or Ishtar's descent. And so I'm going to read just that first section and we will practice doing that. And this is what it says. Ishtar, when she arrived at the gate of Kernugi, which was the name they gave to the underworld, sometimes that's just shortened to Ker, addressed her words to the keeper of the gate. Here, gatekeeper, open your gates for me. Open your gate for me to come in. If you do not open the gate for me to come in, if you do not open the gate for me to come in, I shall smash the door and shatter the bolt. I shall smash the doorpost and overturn the doors. I shall raise up the dead, and they shall eat the living. The dead shall outnumber the living. And so in that little excerpt, you can see examples of both parallelism and repetition. In fact, that's why I chose it. So this section here shows parallelism. Here, gatekeeper, open your gate for me. Open your gate for me to come in. So she's not saying the exact same words, but it's similar enough that it's parallel. It's using parallelism in order to make the story flow nicely and be more poetic. The directions say to underline parallelism in red. On PowerPoint, I'm not able to underline in red, and so I just did the whole thing in red. But I encourage you just to underline in red. There's another example of parallelism in this section. I shall smash the door and shatter the bolt. I shall smash the doorpost and overturn the doors. And so once again, we're going to underline those lines in red. Now, before we go on, we also have an example of repetition in this excerpt. If you do not open the gate for me to come in, if you do not open the gate for me to come in, she says the same exact thing twice in a row. She's emphasizing it, or rather the writer of this poem is emphasizing it. There's some rising tension there through the use of repetition. So we will underline repetition in blue. Now, before we go on to the rest of the excerpt, I'd like to point out that there are some dots in between one section and the other. Whenever you see those dots in any of our source documents, you know that some of the text has been skipped. That's just a placeholder to let you know that something's been taken out. So it goes on to say, he being the keeper of the first door, he led her in through the first door, but stripped off and took away the great crown on her head. Gatekeeper, why have you taken away the great crown on my head? Go in, lady, such are the rights of the mistress of the earth. The mistress of the earth being her sister, Ereshkigal. He led her in through the second door, but stripped off and took away the rings in her ears. Gatekeeper, why have you taken away the rings in my ears? Go in, lady, such are the rights of the mistress of the earth. He led her in through the third door, but stripped off and took away the beads around her neck. Gatekeeper, why have you taken away the beads around my neck? Go in, my lady, such are the rights of the mistress of earth. He led her in through the fourth door, but stripped off and took away the toggle pins on her dress. Gatekeeper, why have you taken away the toggle pins on my dress? Go in, my lady, such are the rights of the mistress of earth. He led her in through the fifth door, but stripped off and took away the belt of birthstones around her waist. Gatekeeper, why have you taken away the belt of birthstones around my waist? Go in, my lady, such are the rights of the mistress of earth. He let her in through the 6th door, but stripped off and took away the bangles on her wrists and ankles. Gatekeeper, why have you taken away the bangles from my wrists and ankles? Go in, my lady, such are the rights of the mistress of earth. He let her in through the 7th door, but stripped off and took away the proud garment she wore. Gatekeeper, why have you taken away the proud garment I wore? Go in, my lady, such are the rights of the mistress of the earth. As soon as Ishtar went down to Carnegie, the underworld, Ereshkigal, her sister, mistress of the earth, and all, looked at her and trembled before her. We're going to flip back to the beginning, and we're going to look for evidence first of parallelism. We have a lot of it in there. He let her in through the 1st door, he let her in through the 2nd door, he let her in through the 3rd door, he let her in through the 4th door. It's not exactly repetition because we can't use the same word every time. She's going through 7 different gates, but it's close enough, and it's done as a literary device just to emphasize and to build the tension. And again, he let her in through the 5th door, he let her in through the 6th door, he let her in through the 7th door, all parallelism. Now let's flip back to the other page, and we're going to look for instances of repetition this time. Gatekeeper, why have you taken away? Go in, my lady, such are the rights of the mistress of the earth. Gatekeeper, why have you taken away? Go in, my lady, such are the rights of the mistress of the earth. Now, you might argue that Gatekeeper, why have you taken away could be parallelism because it ends with the great crown on my head, the rings on my ears, the beads around my neck, the toggle pins at my dress, and I would accept that if that's what you would do. I just chose to say it is repetition because it is so repetitious. Now the rest of that, Gatekeeper, why have you taken away? Go in, my lady. Gatekeeper, why have you taken away? Go in, my lady. Gatekeeper, why have you taken away? Go in, my lady. Such are the rights of the mistress of the earth. So I hope that that made sense to you. Next, we're going to look at the genres of Mesopotamian literature. Now, when we think of modern genres of literature, we have action stories, we have coming-of-age stories, we have mysteries, we have love stories, we have comedies. These aren't the kinds of things that the Mesopotamians wrote about. When historians look through the writings left behind by the people who lived in Mesopotamia, they find that there are 6 different genres that they tended to write about. Probably the most common was writing about the acts of the gods. They wrote about rivalries between the gods, relationships between the gods and men, and speeches that the gods passed on to men, usually to the king. Also, they tended to write about things that kings did, about being a king, about the deeds of the king. They find a lot of devotional material left behind, hymns, prayers, and even magic spells, meant to force the gods' hands into giving them what they wanted. Love stories. We still have those today. Usually, for Mesopotamian literature, that meant a celebration of marriage. These kinds of stories usually were written about Dumuzi, also known as Tammuz, and Ishtar, also known as Inanna, even though we know that she became angry with him and she sent him to the underworld in her place. She does long for him during the 6 months that he's away. There's a lot of poetry about that longing for someone when you're away from the person that you love. And she did keep a 40-day vigil just before he was set to return. She wouldn't eat during those 40 days. She fasted, and she would cry during those 40 days. And people who worshipped Ishtar would celebrate that time of year in the same way. And so a lot of poetry was written about that. They also had humor. A lot of it is very crude humor. We still have that in movies and in books today. But they also had what we call academic humor, sarcasm, the use of puns, using plays on words and satire. And finally, we find wisdom literature, proverbs that were written down, advice, observations, how to do things. And with that all filled in, we conclude our class for today. I hope that you found it helpful. And if you have any questions about the homework this week, you know that you can always email me and ask your questions.